Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak was born in Calcutta in 1942. She is an Indian-American theorist. She was educated in Indian and American universities, and she was a student of the very famous theorist Paul de Man. Paul de Man is remembered along with Derrida, and Spivak was also associated with Derrida. She translated and wrote a lengthy preface to Derrida's Of Grammatology. That is the first major work that she is remembered for. Derrida's Of Grammatology, as you might know, is a book that critiques the whole of Western philosophical tradition. It was published in 1968, and it established the foundations of post-structuralism. Spivak also translated and wrote readings of Mahashweta Devi's stories, especially Imaginary Maps, Choti Munda and His Arrow, and Breast stories. Most of these stories are about tribals in India, and they involve very powerful post-colonial concerns. I wish you would note down these names and look up a little bit extra about these works and their translations. Gayatri Spivak has drawn largely on theories of post-colonialism, deconstruction, feminism, as well as Marxism and the theories of Sigmund Freud. So she cannot be just categorized as a feminist or a post-structuralist or a post-colonialist. She is all of these together. This is Gayatri Spivak again. She has come to India several times as a scholar. She has spoken at universities and conferences. Some of you may have met her. The major works of Spivak includes In Other Worlds, Essays in Cultural Politics. That was published in 1987. Even before that came two important essays. I should have put these essays first. Can the Subaltern Speak was a very seminal essay that came in 1983. And there was 3 women's texts and a critique of imperialism. Both these essays are prescribed in universities. I will deal with both these in detail in this video. 3 women's texts and a critique of imperialism came in 1985. A critique of post-colonial reason is a book that continues the arguments of Can the Subaltern Speak? It is subtitled Toward a History of the Vanishing Present. Some of the ideas of Spivak in this book also shall be discussed in this video. Death of a Discipline is a recent work from 2003. That is also very important. Now let us take a look at these works in detail. Using insights from Marxism, feminism, and deconstruction, in this book, In Other Worlds, Essays in Cultural Politics, Spivak analyzes the relationships between language, women, and culture in both Western and non-Western contexts. In this book, there are 14 critical essays on subjects like language, literary criticism, French feminism, and subaltern studies. And there are also readings of literary works as wide-ranging as To the Lighthouse and The Prelude, and Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi and The Breast Giver. Now let us talk about the very famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? In this 1983 essay, she talks about the Subaltern Studies group and whether intellectuals who write about the subaltern will allow the subaltern to speak. This essay was later expanded in a critique of post-colonial reason, which is perhaps her magnum opus. It came in 1999. So Spivak asks in this essay, can people in subordinate, colonized positions ever achieve a voice? This is a critique of the essentialist foundations of the Subaltern Studies group in India. Spivak was engaged with them. She was one of them actually, but she critiques their own project. The Subaltern Studies group was led by people like Ranajit Guha, Partha Chatterjee, Shahid Amin, and Deepesh Chakraborty. You should particularly take a look at these writers and their works, do some extra reading on them, because the Subaltern Studies group is a very important part of post-colonial criticism. In Can the Subaltern Speak and later A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, Spivak uses the Foucauldian term epistemic violence to talk about the condition of the colonized people. In A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, Spivak argues that the colonial project is characterized by epistemic violence, a term she borrows from Michel Foucault. Epistemic violence refers to the imposition of a set of beliefs by one on another. The colonizer imposed a set of beliefs on the colonized people violently. This is a violence on knowledge or epistemic violence. Certain knowledges, Spivak points out, such as the Hindu legal system, were subjugated or disqualified as inadequate. Indian knowledges, African knowledges, etc., became subjugated as inadequate. They became non-knowledges, unknowledges, because of epistemic violence of colonialism. This can be exemplified in Macaulay's minute. In Macaulay's infamous Minute on Indian Education, there is the argument that the British should teach some Indians English so that those Indians can teach to the rest of the Indian population English knowledges, because Indian knowledges are not worthy of studying. And you know what Macaulay said. I'll quote from his minute. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions and morals, and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to reform the vernacular dialects of the country. Our vernacular dialects will be reformed by that Babu class. To enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. What is frightening is that things haven't changed very much. The rulers have changed from the British to the neo-imperialists. But like the colonial subject, the post-colonial subject continues to be oppressed, to undergo cultural imposition and epistemic violence. Next, we'll talk about how Gayatri Spivak opposes binary oppositions, colonizer versus colonized, oppressor versus oppressed. Such binary oppositions are opposed by Spivak in her writing. Following Foucault, Spivak also asserts that the colonial subaltern subject is irretrievably heterogeneous. You can't homogenize the colonial subject or the colonized people as one. Spivak asserts that because of the heterogeneity of the colonized people, they can't be just simply subjugated. Neither can the colonized people completely resist. It is not a homogeneous discourse that we are addressing here when we talk about the colonial subject. So, because the colonial subject is heterogeneous, the simple binary opposition between the colonizer and the colonized and the oppressor and the victim has to be problematized. It is not as simple as that. There were colonized people who wanted British to rule India. There were colonized people who resisted the British in very different ways. Even the resistance was not a homogeneous entity. And the heterogeneity of the colonized people, therefore, leads us to understand that the colonized people cannot be just put as put on one side of the binary. Even radical intellectuals, therefore, who speak for the subaltern, essentialize and romanticize the other. It is a spelling mistake. Even radical intellectuals like the Subaltern Studies Group, Deepesh Chakravorty, Ranajit Guha, etc., who speak for the subaltern, essentialize the other and romanticize the other. It is invariably there. It is inevitable because the colonized people are not just one homogeneous entity. They can't be talked about in just one single discourse, in one single manner. The intellectual, she says, is complicit in the persistent constitution of the other as the self's shadow. The other is persistently constituted as the self's shadow. So when they talk about the subaltern or the other, they somehow deny the subaltern their identity. This is inevitable. The essay Can the Subaltern Speak ends with the story of Bhubaneshwari Bhaduri, a silenced subaltern, who was actually a relative of Gayatri Spivak. And she uses this example of this woman who committed suicide in 1926 to illustrate how the subaltern invariably loses its voice. Incidentally, you should remember, Can the Subaltern Speak, the essay, is subtitled Speculations on Widow Sacrifice. Towards the end of the essay, Gayatri Spivak talks about a relative of hers, her grandmother's sister, I think, called Bhubaneshwari Bhaduri. She was a 16 or 17-year-old girl who hanged herself because she did not want to take part in a political assassination during the Indian independence movement. In order to avoid this political act of assassination, she killed herself, which was equally political. But the political nature of the act that she did was denied to her. People said that she committed suicide out of love failure. Interestingly, Bhubaneshwari had committed suicide when she was menstruating probably because she did not want this to be said of her. But that is precisely what people said of her. She is the silenced subaltern. Next, we'll talk about another essay by Spivak, 3 Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism. In this essay, it's a post-colonial feminist essay. Spivak shows that feminism has been complicit in Western domination. Like I just told you before, radical intellectuals, even radical intellectuals who speak for the subaltern, are complicit in their subjugation. Like that, feminism has been complicit in Western domination. She studies books like Jean Rice's White Sargasso Sea, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. These are the 3 texts that she studies. And even though they are feminist texts, she shows that these feminist texts are complicit in Western domination or imperial domination. In this essay, she introduces the term worlding, which I will talk about presently. Jane Eyre appears as a prototype of a feminist text, showing a strong woman character. Jane Eyre, the character, is a strong woman character, like a prototype of a feminist, but it is at the expense of Bertha, the mad woman in the attic, the voiceless colonial subject, that Jane Eyre becomes a feminist. It is at the expense of silencing Bertha that in Jane Eyre, the protagonist becomes a feminist. Bertha is analogous to the voiceless colonial subject. Another character Spivak focuses on is St. John Rivers. St. John Rivers proposes to Jane Eyre and she rejects his proposal. And the novel ends with his missionary passage to India. It is St. John Rivers' missionary passage to India that concludes Jane Eyre, the novel. And this is taken for granted as a good thing. St. John Rivers' missionary passage to India leaves the imperialist project unquestioned, as if it is necessary to go to India and civilize India and convert Indians. The imperialist project is unquestioned at the end of Jane Eyre. Here, imperialism is in a worlding process. Worlding is that process by which imperialism disguises itself as natural. We think, oh, it is natural that St. John Rivers and such missionaries should go to India and convert Indians and civilize them. It is natural. That is called worlding. Worlding is a naturalization process. Some aspects of imperialism become part of the world, naturalized as part of the world. And Jane Eyre uses worlding of imperialism and thus is complicit in Western domination. Then there is White Sargasso Sea. Spivak focuses on the character Christophine in White Sargasso Sea. Christophine is the protagonist Antoinette's good Creole nurse. She is half black and she is an Obi woman. Obi woman is a woman who practices black magic. Obi is a practice of the natives in that island in Jamaica where the novel is set. She gets into trouble with the law and her story remains incomplete at the end of the novel. So Christophine is also in this novel a silenced subaltern. She is a silenced stereotype of a Creole woman. Then she talks about Frankenstein in this essay. Frankenstein's monster represents the uncivilized other whose histories are denied and destroyed by colonialism. Frankenstein's monster doesn't get to tell his story completely. Even though some of it is told, he remains the uncivilized other who is destroyed by, whose life is manipulated and destroyed by the master who makes him. Colonialism has a devastating impact on those it tries to create anew, Spivak shows. Like Frankenstein created the monster, the colonizer creates Indians and the colonized people, and the colonized people turn into monsters. Colonialism has a devastating impact on those it tries to create anew. For example, you see in Chinua Achebe's No Longer at Ease, Obi Okonkwo, who is undergoing Western education, but he loses his roots. He doesn't completely get created anew. He doesn't become a model of the colonizer. He becomes liminal in between. He loses the original and he doesn't get the new. He is caught in between two worlds, one dead and the other powerless to be born. He is a confused man. Similarly, in Cry the Beloved Country by Alan Paton, you see Absalom, the character who kills Arthur Jarvis. Absalom is a confused youth, like a monster. Like Frankenstein's monster, colonialism has created monsters out of Absalom and Obi Okonkwo instead of creating them anew completely. All these are examples of worlding. How imperialist ideas and practices become naturalized as part of the world.